Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tracy Bowman. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations and a proud UM alumna, and welcome to the University of Manitoba Alumni and Friends Virtual Learning for Life series. This is our fourth series that we've been offering since the beginning of the global pandemic, and we're so proud that you've been able to join us for all these sessions. If this is your first session, please do go visit our website where you can see a number of other previous sessions and content. There's a lot of amazing speakers that we have profiled over the last 15 months, so I encourage you to do that. Before we begin, like all events at the University of Manitoba, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So again, thank you for joining us and making this part of your day. We are able to offer this program free of charge to all of our alumni and friends around the world, thanks to the very generous sponsorship of our affinity partner, IA Financial Group. Many thanks to them. You can learn more about the insurance options that they offer UM alumni and friends also on our alumni website, so I encourage you to go there. Before we get started, I introduce today's speaker, just a few housekeeping details. So all of you are watching this on YouTube, and we're recording this session as per usual. So after today's session, we will send you a link so you're able to view this again and again, as well as we encourage you to share with friends, colleagues, other alumni, as well as you can look at our other sessions that we've done over the last number of months. Also, you were sent a Slido link, and it's also on the screen right now. This is the way that we are able to get questions from you in the audience. So I'd encourage you to open another window in your browser right now. So it's Slido, SLIDO.com, and the password is VLFL9. So if you just enter that, you'll be able to ask questions at any time throughout the presentation. I encourage you to do that, and we'll try to get through as many as we can throughout the session. So now I'm delighted to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Cary Miller. She's the head of the University of Manitoba's Department of Native Studies, and she's been in that role since 2017, and she'll be presenting on the topic of anti-racism practice. Now, let me tell you a little bit about her before she starts. Dr. Miller is Anishinaabe and descends from the St. Croix and Leech Lake communities. Prior to joining the University of Manitoba, she held positions at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Her research is in the Anishinaabe leadership in the early 19th century, Anishinaabe women's history, treaties and sovereignty, Wisconsin Indian history, and cultures of the Great Lakes region. She's also regularly presented and shares her knowledge at various outreach initiatives at the university through things like the Indigenous Scholar Speaker Series. She's also been a panelist on Visionary Conversation series on the topic of what does a decolonized Canada look like? And she also hosts a 10-week summer institute on the literacy of Indigenous content for both faculty and staff at the University of Manitoba. So with that, over to you, Dr. Miller.
Bonjour, Gachekwe Indigenous Makwendo Ojibwe Anishinaabe Ndao. Miigwech, thank you for spending your time with us this afternoon. Don't worry, the rest of the presentation will be in English, but as an Indigenous scholar, to me, it's important to position myself in my own language. So today we're going to talk about anti-racism practice and settler privilege. The sort of subtitle, The Invisible Knapsack and How to See It and Unpack It, is based on an article called The Invisible Knapsack that first started the discussion around privilege and its role in inequity. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start out with a number of definitions. So who are Indigenous people in Canada? Indigenous people descend from the nations present in Canada prior to European arrival. First Nations are governance of the Indigenous nations of Canada established under the Indian Act. First Nations peoples are people who are status Indians under the Indian Act, but may or may not identify with one of the First Nation governments established under that act. Métis, a blended people and culture derived from unions between indigenous and European people who have continued ties to a historical Métis community and are accepted by that community. The Manitoba Métis Federation is a Métis community that identifies membership as descendants of families who formed a government under Louis Riel in 1869-70. And the Inuit are indigenous peoples of the Arctic. And this is broadly conceived, given that we have the Inuit in US, Canadian, and Danish jurisdictions. Greenland is a part of Denmark. And they are not included under the Indian Act. In fact, the Inuit are perhaps the earliest of the indigenous communities to have full citizenship rights in Canada, as well as be identified as Indigenous people, because Canada needed the Inuit to be citizens in order to lay claim to the Arctic at certain points in the 20th century, particularly during World War II. Next slide. So colonialism. Colonialism is the policy of a country which seeks to extend or retain its full or partial political control over other people or territories, generally with the aim of economic dominance through resource extraction and or trade. Settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous nations and peoples and their resource rights with an invasive settler society that develops a distinct identity and sovereignty independent from that which the indigenous peoples previously held, and seeks to essentially erase the presence of indigenous people, or assumes the erasure of indigenous people through assimilation, displacement, and in some cases genocide. So this is a broad definition. This is not saying that all of this has happened in Canada, but Canada is often defined, along with the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and several other nations, as settler colonial nations. So colonialism as an economic system of extraction and trade might be seen in areas such as Africa, where other countries are making agreements with those governments to extract resources and leave, often leaving very little of the revenue for the country in question. Settler colonialism is different because people come and settle alongside resource extraction, and as part of that settlement, create their own government that displaces the governance of indigenous people. So why does this play into a discussion of anti-racism? Because racism can exist independently of colonialism, but colonialism is always supported, at least in part, through a racial ideology. The idea that one group of people has preeminent right to resources over another people is usually supported by beliefs that the people originally possessing the resource either don't use it properly or are in some way undeserving of that resource. So colonialism generally cannot exist in the absence of racism, as racism is used to support the economic, cultural, moral, social sense of superiority of the colonizing people. Next slide. So I've identified Canada as a colonial nation. In particular, I like to always go through the ways that we here in the city of Winnipeg, many of you who are alumni certainly were here at one point, even if you're not here now, that we benefit from colonialism even today, that colonialism is not a thing in the past, it is an ongoing experience. So for example, the city of Winnipeg gets its water from Shoal Lake First Nation, who is not allowed to use that water by law. The aqueduct built more than 100 years ago to bring that water to Winnipeg from Shoal Lake separated the reserve community from the mainland so that they could not access the Canadian road system until about 2 years ago when a bridge was finally built. it's fairly telling that the community refers to that bridge as Freedom Road. Imagine, we just had a storm here today. Let's say one of my gutter drain spouts had broken off and gotten smashed up. I can pop down to Home Depot, get a new one, fix it, we're all good. When you are not connected to the road system, there are a lot of things that you cannot do on your own without great expense. Most goods coming into the community have to either come in by ice road or by plane in that instance, and the expense of shipping things in by plane to remote communities is very high. Most non-reserve land and resources in Canada were transferred through treaties with First Nations that remain in effect. However, some territories, such as British Columbia, were claimed without treaties. All Manitoba lands were transferred through treaty, but not all of the current First Nations living in Manitoba were signatories to those treaties. The commissioners at the time invited the various bands that they felt were party to the lands that they wished to acquire, but somehow in that process missed 5 of our First Nations, who therefore don't have the guaranteed treaty rights that our other First Nations have. Hydroelectric plants that supply power to many Canadian cities have flooded productive Indigenous reserve lands, damaging traditional subsistence and tourism income, as well as jobs. The hydroelectric plants function by controlling the flow of water, which means periodically flooding. When this flooding occurs, it will carry off bushes or sometimes even trees, depending on the force of the flood, from the riverbanks into the river. This absolutely destroys fish spawning grounds, changes the ecology and makeup of the river itself, and so really has damaged some of these tourism opportunities. But also, I've seen photos of reserves here in Manitoba where recreation areas, baseball diamonds, tennis courts have been flooded by the actions of the hydroelectric plants. At least 55 Canadian First Nations do not have safe drinking water and are under boil water advisories. One of the pressure points that the UN has been placing on Canada of late is their assertion that everyone has the right to safe, clean drinking water. Many of these 55 Canadian First Nations are fly-in communities where there's only one shop that serves, that provides any of the goods that people can purchase, and where a 12-pack of bottled water can cost as much as $100. And I often point out to people, particularly now in terms of this pandemic, cleanliness, frequent hand washing with safe, clean water is part of the public health recommendations. And in a context where that water is not available, that's a significant problem. 7 of these fly-in communities are here in Manitoba. Next slide, please. So digging further into colonization then, now that we've realized that it's ongoing. First, colonization includes 4 different dimensions. The quest for land and resources, in which the colonized other is perceived as an impediment that needs to be controlled so that the colonizer can exploit resources. This is known as extractive colonialism. It involves little Indigenous displacement and may even rely on Indigenous labor. Settler colonialism functions through the replacement of Indigenous populations with instead a settler population organized or supported by an external authority that over time develops its own distinctive identity and sovereignty, so that we can see in both the historical context of Canada and the United States, at one point they were governed by external foreign powers, but after a certain moment developed their own internal sovereignty that they continued to exert over Indigenous populations. Next slide, please. Colonial ideology. I mentioned earlier that the colonial ideology often intersects or always intersects with racism. Colonialism requires a specific ideology about colonized peoples in order to proceed. And I frame it this way because in the end, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to do something horrible today, or very few people do. People wake up and say, I want to do X, Y, or Z, and I want to be able to believe I'm doing it in a moral manner, and I want to be able to sleep at night having done the action. So when we look at the historical past, and even at times at the present moment, we find racism and narratives of progress and so forth that are used to disenfranchise those who possess these resources. Even the poorest colonizer thinks themselves superior to the colonized. And an example of that would be, for example, race slavery in the American South, where even poor whites, very poor whites, saw themselves as having more in common with the wealthy planter elite than with the slave class, precisely because they felt themselves superior through racial definitions to that population. This ideology presumes that people at a distance have a need and a right to a resource that supersedes those who are living where the resource is. 19th century imperial documents are full of words and concepts like inferior, subject races, subordinate peoples, dependency, wardship, expansion, and progress, which are all euphemisms for this ideology and for the racial hierarchy they were putting in place to engage in colonialism. Indigenous people continue to be racially constructed in very specific ways to maintain their positionality as inferior, which means they are victims of ongoing colonial violence in various ways. Next slide, please. So colonial violence, and here we're looking at intergenerational trauma. We're using violence in a much broader definition. It can include actual violence, but it can also include psychological terrorism, theft. So in terms of some of the recent current events, we would say, for example, that when families are separated, as happened during the residential school period, for most of the lifetime of the child, this is essentially an act of psychological violence that has long-term intergenerational trauma for both the parents and the children. So violence in colonies not only looks to other the colonized, it seeks to dehumanize them to justify removing resources from their jurisdiction. Everything will be done to eliminate their traditions, to substitute language, to destroy their culture. And that's a quote from Sartre. Violence in this context can be defined as the learned negative, cumulative, multi-generational actions, values, beliefs, attitudes, and behavioral patterns practiced by one or more people that weaken or destroy the harmony and well-being of an Indigenous individual, family, community, or nation. Next slide, please. So finally, colonization is continued and ongoing. Many Indigenous people in Canada essentially live in what might be described as third world living conditions, lack of access to safe drinking water, lack of adequate housing being examples of that. Colonialism has created a structural inequality Indigenous people feel as individuals and as communities. The colonization of Indigenous people is continually perpetuated through individual acts of racism and violence that are reinforced through dominant ideologies and structures of society. Indigenous people are denied access to social, economic, and political systems that regulate, define, and control all aspects of their lives. So, when we look at individual acts of racism, we have seen many very overt acts of racism, even on our own campus. The teepee at the NCTR was slashed a few years ago at the beginning of term as students were coming to campus in the fall. We've had signage put up that is disparaging and in the online environment. We've seen an increase in race-based and gender-based conflict. So these things are ongoing, and they're things that even in our university community, we have to address and come to terms with. Next. So racism. Racism needs to be understood as an embedded historical system of institutional power. And I think it's really important to understand racism as a system that functions independently from the intentions or self-images of individual actors. And I emphasize that because a lot of times, we try to have a conversation and we say, hey, this particular policy is a barrier to our community. Or we say, hey, we want to talk to you about this term that we consider disparaging that we'd like you to ask not to be used. This is not presenting a situation where we're accusing an individual of purposely getting up and deciding to be racist that day. It is trying to inform people about a system in which they participate, about which they may not be aware. And I emphasize that so that we can get away from the sort of defensive reactions that we talk about as fragility. And I'll get to fragility in a moment, in order to have the constructive conversation. So racism differs from individual racial prejudice and racial discrimination in the historical accumulation and ongoing use of institutional power and authority to support prejudice and to systematically enforce discriminatory behaviors with far-reaching effects. What this means is that sometimes laws are passed that have a impact that disproportionately affects one group of people compared to another, even if racial terms are not even in the words of the law itself. And I think we can see examples of that in, for example, the discussions about voter laws in the state of Georgia in the United States. They're making laws about where and when polls will be available that have a disproportionate impact on the Black population compared to the white, but there's nothing in that legislation that names it and identifies it as specifically targeting that group. So dominant members of society hold social and institutional positions that allow them to infuse their prejudice, their bias into laws, policies, practices, symbols, and norms that become perpetuated long after they're approved without conscious intention. We do X because we've always done it that way. And I mentioned earlier, sometimes we may try to point out, for example, a problem with a practice, a problem with a policy that creates barriers. And one of the things that we commonly hear is, but we've always done it this way. This is the way things are done, which is a very, uncritical way to think about that. When having these conversations at the university, I'll remind folks that the University of Manitoba Act is from the 1960s, and that as a society, we've moved forward in various ways on race, gender, ableism, all kinds of different ways that we respect people more than might have been the case in the mid-1960s, so that we should think about policy change, and we should think about what we can do to bring the impact of our policies in line with our current beliefs about how we should be offering to a broad society today. So racism is a society-wide dynamic that occurs at the group level, is primarily committed by those who have the collective social and institutional power and privilege to create and enforce societal rules that establish false hierarchies of human value. And often those who are perpetuating that system may not even be aware that they're doing so. Next slide, please. So the iceberg model comes in a lot of different trainings for different purposes, but I've grabbed it here to show the difference between what we commonly think of when we discuss racism: overt bias, racial slurs, even nonverbal aggressions, rolling your eyes, sitting in the back of the room with your arms crossed. These are often discussed as nonverbal statements of resistance. That's what we see. But it's the institutional systemic racism that is the larger part of that iceberg, that is submerged beneath the water, and that we as BIPOC individuals often hit in advance of there ever being that overt racial bias, racial slurs, and so forth. Next slide. So one of the things that helps us identify where inequity exists is getting an understanding of privilege. Privilege is an unearned benefit given to people who fit into a specifically defined social or ethnic group. Society grants privilege to people because of certain aspects of their identity: race, class, gender, sexual orientation, language, geographic location, ability, and religion, to name but a few. Those individuals defined as outside of the privileged group feel oppressed by systems that grant privileges to others. Those who are experiencing that privilege often see that as the status quo, as normal, and don't realize that they are benefiting from privilege. So privilege is the flip side in many ways to oppression, but it's more difficult for the individual benefiting from privilege to recognize, because being mistreated is likely to leave a bigger impression than being treated fairly. Next slide. Privilege needs to be understood in relation to systems of power and control. To the extent that racism is systemic and historically encoded in the laws and customs of organizations and governments, over time, those in power tend to pass laws or policies that reinforce their control and their benefit from political, economic, and social power. So privileged people can and often do use their positions to benefit people like themselves, and can self-perpetuate their privileged access to positions of power. Privilege is not a two-way street. Even if an affirmative action program is established, the group seems to grant privilege to another group in order to achieve equity, as long as that group is not in a position to establish laws, rules, or regulations. They will not have a say in what constitutes equity or whether or not equity has been achieved. And this is a really important point. We at the University of Manitoba engaged a few years ago in the development of an Indigenous governance report describing how we could bring Indigenous voice into our governing system so that there would be Indigenous discussion in establishing and approving our rules, regulations, policies, and so forth. This is how we really begin to achieve equity, because then Indigenous people are a part of the discussion of what constitutes equity. If we are not in that conversation, then it is still the privileged group that is making all the decisions around what is equity and what is not. Next slide, please. Intersectionality. Because we are all complex beings with multiple aspects to our identities, we can be privileged by one aspect of our identity while being oppressed due to another. So when privilege and oppression intersect, they don't negate one another. Privilege simply means that under the exact same set of circumstances, life would be harder without your privilege. So examples of individuals who are experiencing privilege from one identity and oppression for another might be white women, white men living in poverty, a cisgender Indigenous male, a wealthy Black person. So, those are ways that we can think about where status, social class, sexual identity, and all of these things can inflect, and really most of us are at the intersection of various different systems of oppression and control, as well as systems of privilege. Next slide, please. So when I try to really clearly explain what unconscious racism in an organization is like and how it is experienced, I pick up this example that actually comes out of women's studies, was originally used to describe patriarchy. That the experience of oppression is like being a bird inside of a cage. Each of the wires of the cage reinforces the others and makes the cage stronger. So each policy and procedure reinforces the other and makes the feeling of oppression stronger. If you are a person with privilege, the privilege brings you so close to the cage that you're seeing in between the bars and you can't see the oppression affecting the bird. And you're left wondering why the bird doesn't fly away. What we need to start doing as individuals is to step back from that cage to identify the bars nearest us, the bars that we may have some influence and control over, and work to deconstruct those bars. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that we would come and talk a little bit more about fragility. When an individual points out the negative impact of systemic bias on them, the discussion usually shifts to focus on the intentions of the person hearing the complaint rather than on the issue that has been brought up for discussion. So this defensive focus on intentions is known as fragility. And basically, if someone has brought a concern to you and you find yourself dropping into a stance of defense rather than a stance of constructive, constructively dealing with the concern, then you may be accidentally falling into fragility. And the basic problem of fragility is that it emphasizes intention rather than the impact of what occurred. Next slide, please. So I love this cartoon for showing intention versus impact. Here we have our dragon. He's clearly breathed fire on this poor little person who is now burnt to a crisp and smoking still. And the dragon says, if I tell you it's a sign of affection, then it's a sign of affection. I can't help it if you're flammable. That's focusing on the intention rather than the impact of the action. So fragility often manifests as an emotional reaction that redirects the discussion to convincing the accuser that one is not, in this case, a racist, but it could just as well be, is not sexist, is not biased against people with disabilities or what have you. These emotional reactions fail to separate intention from impact and prevents the attempt to address what made the accuser uncomfortable and once again reinforces the status quo, preventing change. And that's the real big piece. We can't allow the discussion. If there's a problem, we should discuss and solve the problem rather than focusing on the intent. When we focus on the intent, we don't solve the problem and nothing changes. Next slide. So people can react with fragility for a variety of reasons. There may be social taboos against discussing race openly. Some people sort of fall into what's known as the racist bad, non-racist good binary, rather than understanding that talking about racism as a system is very different than talking about whether an individual exhibits personal bias. Fear or resentment toward people of color. The delusion that we are objective individuals, deep investment in a system that benefits us and that we've been conditioned to see as fair, a deep cultural legacy of anti-group sentiment, or a lack of training about what race and racism really is. Next slide. So one of the things that helps us to improve our interactions and improve our anti-racism practice is recognizing the various types of fragility that people may experience, so that we can then sort of redirect the conversation away from the fragility. So the first is expertise. This involves an assumed expertise that insulates the individual from self-reflection or from the criticism that you are raising. So I gave 2 examples here. I've got a lot of Indigenous friends and they said, or I've done a lot of projects with Indigenous communities and in my opinion. So in both of these, the individual speaker is invoking a type of expertise rather than listening to the individual that has brought a problem to their attention. Next. Emotion, used to deflect from the discussion of long-term structural inequity or deployed to signal virtue and good intentions, again, but insulating the individual from self-reflection. I feel so sad and guilty about what's been done. This is one that I hear a lot as a teacher of classes in Indigenous history, is folks saying, I feel very sad and I feel very guilty. And I point out the intention of sharing these histories of things that have been done in previous generations is not to make you feel guilty now. It's to show how we got to where we're at and ask the question, where do we want to go from here? So the feelings of being sad and being guilty are less helpful than recognizing the truth of what happened in the past so that we can make sound policy decisions on that truth as we move forward in the present. Another one is, I'm so afraid of what will happen if I act that it's better not to act. And I hear this one a lot, and I really understand where it's coming from. People say, you know, gosh, I hear that I'm supposed to be putting more Indigenous content in my classes, but I don't know enough to decide what good content is. I don't know how to manage race in my classroom, so I'm afraid to make the attempt. And I think that's one of the reasons that we try to increase the amount of training that we're doing on campus. But there's also the reality that if you are afraid to speak, if you are afraid to interrupt an act of bias that is happening right in front of you because you're afraid to act and what the consequences would be, then you are reinforcing the structure and again, allowing it to continue to exist. So, you know, lately myself and others on campus who do this kind of training have been encouraging people to lean in, to choose to enter a space where that may be a little bit uncomfortable, because we recognize that all human beings make mistakes, and there are many of us who are more than willing to come and you know, help you learn through those mistakes. I certainly have never, I certainly can't look back on my life and say that I've never made a mistake here and there, and I certainly don't hold anybody to a standard that I can't myself hold. Next slide, please. So seeing the negative, focusing on Indigenous or other racialized people as deficient or problematized, rather than seeking the policy that created the problem and working to change it. So, you know, here, I think in particular, you know, this is incorporating that, that sort of racialized underpinning of colonialism. These are people who are deficient in some manner, says colonialism, therefore we can access resources. So the kinds of statements you might hear are, we really have to focus on fixing the problems. How can you fix the problem if you don't have an understanding of the cause? If you're assuming that the cause is in the person rather than in historical forces, past policies and events. Why are Indigenous people so angry? We recently did a training video on campus, and one of our elders said, did you ever notice that when people are not listening to you, you raise your voice a little bit? And she said, so if you're hearing people shouting, it's because they haven't been listened to for a very long time. So perceiving indigenous people or gendered people or any of the other categories we've talked about as angry, it means that they haven't been listened to, and we need to, again, focus on the problem rather than focusing on any perceived anger. Why are indigenous people so dependent? And again, we're not looking at the policies and procedures. Law and policy has created a dependency on the part of indigenous people by restricting their movement historically, by restricting their food access, by removing resources from their use. So the dependency is one that were you able to take a full history class, we could really demonstrate the historical creation of that dependency in a way that is supporting the privilege of society and is something that today we should look at constructive ways to unpack and to change. Next slide, please. Structure. This involves the ways in which work processes and structures are used as both a reason for an action or to validate an action. This is not the kind of work I do. I'll delegate it to someone else, whether or not they have the needed expertise. I will or will not allocate funds or resources to solving this. The system really just thwarts this kind of work. It's to blame, right? This is the procedure that must be followed. Other solutions can't be considered. This is well, we've always done it that way. Why should it change? Or I can't find indigenous people to work with, so I can't do the work. So these are all structural deflections that, again, you're not dealing with the problem. You're choosing to deflect it in one way or another. Next slide. Politeness or fear. This deflection occurs through well-meaning politeness, originating from a fear of not wanting to offend. It leads to stasis and maintenance of the status quo. It may also derive from the discomfort of not knowing what to do, but feeling like you should have the ability to contribute without self-reflection. So again, lean into that discomfort. So here are things that people will say if they've been engaging in this form of fragility deflection. I didn't want to offend anyone by saying the wrong thing. It's best just to listen than to consult several people. Corollary, if the indigenous people give me contradictory advice, I can call the situation unsolvable and walk away. I've seen other people get it wrong and I don't want to. These are all ways to avoid change rather than to address and engage in change. Next slide. Denial of the problem. Claiming not to be a racist when someone points out that a policy you are implementing is inequitable, or saying that policies are race neutral is denial. I don't see race, I'm colorblind, I'm not a racist. Those kinds of statements are denial of the problem. In 1896, the United States Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of Jim Crow segregation in Plessy versus Ferguson decision under the separate but equal doctrine. Justice John Harlan wrote in his dissenting opinion, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. The white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country. I doubt not it will continue to be for all time if it remains true to its great heritage." So on the one hand, he's making this argument for colorblind structures, but at the same time is evincing his own belief in a racial disparity that clearly these structures are upholding. Certainly the court decision in and of itself to uphold the constitutionality of Jim Crow is this kind of, on the one hand, denial of the problem, but also the earlier deflection of the structure itself. Next slide. So microaggressions. This is a term that's been around for less time than some of these other concepts. The definition is the everyday verbal and nonverbal slights, indignities, put-downs, and insults that members of marginalized groups experience in their day-to-day interactions with individuals, whether intentional or unintentional, that transmit hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to a target person because they belong to a stigmatized group. Common nonverbal microaggressions can include eye rolling, deep sighs, clutching your purse closer as you pass a person of color. Verbal microaggressions might include phrases like, no, I mean, where are you really from, right? If you are a second or third generation newcomer to Canada, but from a part of the world other than Europe, that is something you might hear. Bottom line, born in Canada, raised here, experienced here, it's rude to insist that somebody claim to be from elsewhere when they are from Canada, born and raised. This is one that I've actually had school teachers ask me when I was young. You're ethnic, what are you? Which makes you feel much more like an object than a person. You don't act like a normal Indigenous person. It's basically revealing a certain bias that you're seeing someone not live up to. Can I touch your hair? Or you're not a real Canadian. I have a friend who is Indian, Black, Asian, etc., and they said, so these are all verbal microaggressions that it's best to avoid and to find another way to interact in conversation and build relationships. Next slide. Consequences of microaggressions can lead to negative impacts on the target individual's eating habits, trust, health, mental health, essentially all of the health outcomes that we associate with stress. And these impacts can be very long lasting. I've talked to people who have decided to return to school and change careers because of the amount of daily microaggressions they experience from coworkers despite being very good at their jobs. Next slide. So systemic racism and colonialism, when they intersect and at their point of intersection, we often hear a deficit model that explains why an inequality that benefits a particular group exists. So deficit ideology is a worldview that explains and justifies outcome inequalities, poverty, unequal educational access, poor health, by pointing to supposed deficiencies within the individuals or communities of the disenfranchised, rather than the policies and procedures that led to impoverishment, unequal educational access, and so forth. So under this deficit ideology, it is not the ableism, racism, sexism, heterosexism or of the privileged that gets in the way of communicating across difference, but the disability, culture, biology, or lifestyle of the other. In sum, the cultural deficit approach reinforces an important epistemological cornerstone of imperialism. The colonized possess a series of noble characteristics that can be studied, known, and managed accordingly by the colonizers, whose own complicity remains masked. This is such an important concept, and we hear it in politics all the time. Well, of course, we should, cut this program or cut that program because the people who are receiving the benefits are in some way undeserving, rather than recognizing that those benefits are there to address the systemic inequality that previous policies have created. Next slide. Okay. So, that's next slide. I left that one in there and I should have taken it out. Okay. So, becoming aware of group privilege and raising its benefits to the conscious level is the first step in achieving equity. I think I want to stop here and check in for questions. I've seen the link for questions scroll across a few times. Did we have any come in?
Yes, we do have two questions. So great time to break. Cary, thank you for all of that really great information. Josh or Mike, are you able to bring up on the screen Perfect. Okay, so the first question is, any suggestions for ways individuals who are not in a position of upper management or authority can push or advocate for systemic change within an institution?
And that's such a difficult one because, the power and authority is such a difficult piece to crack. But I find working with unions or joining organizations that support your community are good ways, so that when you go to your supervisor, you can say, well, I'm coming with this concern, but it's supported by my union. Or I've been to this organization and they provided me with all of these studies that I'd like you to consider that demonstrate why this is a problem. If you're working in an environment where there are committees that are governing certain aspects of your workplace, that can be another place to go to seek to find allies for change.
Okay, thank you, Cary. The next question is similar in theme, and that is, do you have any strategies to recommend when encountering racism expressed by senior staff? Fear of reprisal consequences can definitely mute any response.
Yeah, there's no question about that. And, these are some of the reasons why we need very systemic training across our province. The NCTR calls to action talk about training all public officials, but I think it's really anybody, right? When we think about, our province is 20% Indigenous. And so that means 1 out of 5 coworkers, colleagues, employees, patients, customers, clients is Indigenous. And so if you're acting in a rude way, you are hurting your business model, no matter what. And so I guess, again, I would say certainly working with organizations so that you are not someone they can isolate out and punish is certainly one good way to go about it. But the other can be to talk about, hey, I've seen this problem in our workplace. I would like this to be a successful business. Have you considered that? Because this is a place that's 20% Indigenous, this may be costing us some business because these actions are taking place, or may be costing us some of the best employees because these actions are taking place.
All very good points. I don't know if we have, I just put another last call out for questions if anybody does have any. I was just going to mention the point that you mentioned. I've heard this a lot more lately, is that intention versus impact. And my perception is that I think many people, especially in the non-Indigenous community, are so concerned with being perceived to be racist, or say, I'm not racist, right? And are very, well, I didn't intend for that to be the outcome of how you feel, right? And I think I'm so glad that you've mentioned that intention versus impact, because it doesn't matter what you're saying, it's how we intend it. It's how you've made the person feel and what you've said. So thank you for that. And I hope people are listening and learning that, because it is so important as part of the conversation. Cary, do you have time for one more question? I think there's a few have come through now. So let me just check these off here. And I think that one's done. Okay, so a comment. My child has been asked, where are you really from? As you mentioned earlier, 20 times though, she was less or more than 20 times though, she was born and raised here, and she speaks English, French, and a third language. So just, I've heard that too. Yeah, where are you really from? If you're wearing a hijab or something. And
yeah, it's a question to avoid. It really is perceived as othering and alienating by the person who it's directed to. There's other ways, right? If you want to learn more about a person, sit down at a coffee break and just, do you have kids? And often you'll find out some of this information organically through becoming friends, rather than asking sort of a pointed, rude question to a stranger.
Yeah, Yeah, or segmenting them or putting them in a box right away without learning them as a person. You're absolutely right, Cary. Yes. And the next question, if you're able to bring it up on the screen, fragility, like your dragon cartoon, what do we do if we did make a mistake, equaling no intention? How to handle it now? Is this if something has happened? So any advice that you can provide if that does happen?
Well, and and I'm going to approach this from both sides. So let's say you're the person who needs to make a complaint, and I think it's very fair to go and say, look, I need to talk to you about something that happened that made me really uncomfortable. I'm not making any personal accusations here, but there's a policy that's causing some problems. So, there you're already providing the person some cover so that they don't immediately fall into that defensiveness. On the other side, how do you avoid it? I think in the end, you're going to find that dealing with the problem, right, is the best solution. I know it's hard. I know we've kind of been programmed to immediately go, oh, but I didn't intend that. I'm not, racist, ableist, et cetera. But it's trying to be reflective enough to recognize it in yourself, really, and move towards, could you tell me again exactly how that policy was a problem? Do you have suggestions about how that policy could be improved to remove the problem? Work the problem and try to refrain from taking it personally, because often, our coworkers, our employees are people that we know and respect as human beings. We haven't intended a harm. And the person bringing that to our attention is actually improving our workplace, improving our business. So if we can move straight to dealing with the problem and implementation, then we're in a much better place.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think coming from that perspective, we're trying to improve whatever the institution is exactly the way of moving forward. Cary, I know it's 1:57, and the reason I mentioned the time for everybody who's viewing is, in the spirit of outreach, Cary's got another meeting she has to go to do some more training. So we're so lucky that we have you here at the University of Manitoba, Cary, and all the wonderful things you've shared with us. I hope all of our viewers have been able to take something away. I encourage you to listen to this again. There was so much great information that was shared that would help all of us, no matter where we work, no matter how we connect with people. So thank you very much for all that great information. Just to promote for next week, if anyone hasn't registered for next week, we did have a bit of a change in our schedule, and so we're letting you know if you did register for a previous one. Next week's speaker is Dr. Gordon Goldsborough, who was actually recently named to the Order of Manitoba, and he will be speaking on preparing to restore Manitoba's Net-Leibau Marsh, the largest freshwater coastal wetland in North America. So a very different topic. He's within our Faculty of Sciences in the Department of Biological Sciences. So if you haven't registered, I encourage you to do that. Thank you so much again, Dr. Miller. Everybody who's watching, well, as I said, you'll get a recording of this. You'll also be asked to respond to a survey. We encourage you to do that. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. This has been a really, really wonderful hour and lots of great info. Have a wonderful week, everyone, and we will see you next Wednesday.
Thank you.